Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Up to you. But I think they'd like to know that you...
Okay. All right, we're live, ladies and gentlemen. Ready for the show. This is going to be a big one, I tell you. I don't know, those of you who've had the opportunities to hear this man speak earlier, well, it was quite the show. And we have two more panelists here who are going to really rattle your sabers. I have to say a few things before. First of all, I'm just going to say hello. I'm Gunnar Splatais. I am an adjunct professor at the Mortensen Center in Global Engineering and Resilience. I am an environmental economist. I've worked in development for 30 plus years. You know, when I do that with my students, I was like, I'm starting to, age myself here. But hey, it's the experience that counts, right? I am actually, believe it or not, a Brazilian. And I come to the States through many meanderings throughout the world, but anyway, here I am. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. I have to say the following. Today is 11th of April of 2024, and it is 3:20. This is panel 17996, and it's titled Global Hegemony, Who Gets a Seat at the Table? Big title. All right, before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure that you get a chance to ask questions. Here is how we're going to handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from you guys, from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand, and we have producers in the back who will find you and give you a note card. And then we ask that you write your question on the card. Please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist for, if you'd like more information, their CVs are way too long. We'd spend here another hour here talking, just reading their CVs. So all I want to say, I have right here to my left, Joe. Joe, I forgot to ask how you pronounce your name.
Give it a try.
All right, okay.
Cirincione.
Cirincione,
Not that bad.
Yeah, okay, cool. Well, Joe has been a member of the Council of Foreign Affairs for 40 years. He's been an advisor to the State Department, and he's been an advisor on 3 presidential campaigns. Do I need to say anything more? Next to Joe is Roina He, and she hails from China. She's a historian of modern contemporary Chinese society and politics. Her first book, Tiananmen Exiles, Voices of the Struggles for Democracy in China, was named to the top 5 books of 2014 by the Asia Society's China File. She's passionate about teaching, and she has received various certificates of teaching excellence. After all of these, in one of them in Hong Kong at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, after receiving these certificates of excellence, she was denied a visa to return to Hong Kong. She publishes and speaks widely and has op-eds, and here you go, the Washington Post, the Nation, the Guardian, the Globe and Mail, and on we go. She has been designated the top 100 Chinese public intellectuals in 2016. So, Roina, thank you for being here. Last but not least, well, I forgot to do that one too. Charles, Miss Lunga. Hey, I got it. All right. Well, I think that the thing to say about Charles is he's a person who cares about Africa. He's an entrepreneur who is focusing on educating, mentoring, and training the next generation of leaders in Kenya and East Africa. All right, with no further ado, I would like to ask that each panelist give a brief 5-minute introduction, talk about the issues. We are dealing with the global hegemony, who gets a seat at the table. And the description that's in your panel says, while the United States and China vie to be the sole superpower, what role do other nations play in impacting global hegemony? And with that, I will leave it and invite Joe to impart some of his wisdom to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. I've done, this is my 6th panel in the 2 days I've been here, and it's my last panel, and I gotta tell you how much I've enjoyed being at this conference. It's just a wonderful and unique event, and every time I come, I'm just delighted, and I learn so much, both from my fellow panelists and from sneaking away and getting to see Ebert interrupt us, and I want to go see this other panel. Why are grandma and grandpa running the country? So I'll go see this. But let's talk about a global hegemony here. The national security strategy of the United States begins by saying we're in an era of great power competition. And that's how they characterize the moment. That's how they frame the strategic challenge. I actually would disagree with that. I would argue that the climate crisis is really the bigger determinant of what's going to happen to U.S. and international security over the next several decades, rather than the competition. But the competition is real. The U.S. system that was established after 1945 is teetering. It is under direct assault. It has been weakened by some of its own failures and its own internal contradictions, but there's no question that it's being challenged by the rising authoritarian states led by Russia and China. But these are 2 very different threats, in my view, and I want to differentiate them because it then determines what our strategy is. Not everybody sees them as 2 distinct threats. Today in Washington, the Minister of Defense for Australia, who's in town for meetings, declared, quote, "We face the biggest arms race in our region since 1945 and the greatest strategic uncertainty, and we are responding." And he's talking specifically about the alliance that's been built, the AUKUS alliance of Australia, United Kingdom, and the US to help Australia build nuclear-powered submarines and to develop their national security cooperation. He comes to Washington the same day that the President of the United States right now is meeting with the leaders of Japan and the Philippines, the first time that has happened, to increase US strategic and military ties among those three nations. Why? All of this is focused on China. The consensus view in Washington is that this is a period of great power competition and that the pacing threat, as the National Defense Strategy says, is China. So China is the reason we are doing so many of the things we're doing in these kinds of meetings. In our defense buildup, the president has presented an historically high defense budget to the Congress, $876 billion. So we're closing in on $1 trillion budget. Just to give you some perspective on that, in 2001, before the 20 years of the War on Terror, we were spending about $300 billion a year on defense. So we've tripled it since 2001. And again, the big justification for that, the strategic framing, is great power competition. And part of what that means is, who gets to exercise global hegemony? Who gets to run the world? Who gets to create the institutions and run the institutions? There are two different challenges on this from these two great power competitors. And one is the more direct and immediate, and that's from Russia. It is a direct military challenge. Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago was the first time a country in Europe had sought to change the boundaries of another country in Europe by force since 1945. This is a direct challenge not just to Ukraine, but the entire system of security. So that's why the Ukraine conflict, while serious in and of itself, has global implications. And it's widely believed, and I believe this, that China's territorial ambitions do not end with Ukraine, that they have, and Putin has said this, they have their eyes on the Baltics, they have their eyes on part of Poland. This is part of Putin's effort to exercise hegemony in the region. And he complements that with the direct assault on the US democracy. You may have seen the stories just recently. Russian intelligence has released a whole trove of Russian intelligence papers outlining how they are penetrating the American media space, the American social media space, the American political parties to get their message in. And in fact, they have succeeded in large part in penetrating the Republican Party. Two leading national security leaders of the Republican Party complained just over the weekend that so many members of their party are mouthing Putin's words. So this is serious great power competition. China, in my view, is different. To me, it represents less of a military threat, even though we're responding in a military way, as it does in sort of an institutional threat. China seeks to retool these global institutions more to China's liking. It would argue that it's unfairly, well, certainly, you'll tell me, but that it's disadvantaged by the structure of these institutions. So it either wants to reform them or create its own alternative global security, global economic enterprises that can exert China's rule. But to me, China doesn't represent a direct military threat. Yes, we talk a lot about Taiwan, but we should be honest. Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of China. An invasion of Taiwan should be opposed. We don't want another country invading an independent entity. Taiwan's not a country, but an independent entity. But we're not talking about China invading Long Island. We're talking about a potential conflict on China's periphery. And most of what we're talking about is the US Navy and US military forces, and now the alliances we're building, trying to contain China. China, understandably, doesn't want to be contained, doesn't want to be singled out that way. They're not doing that to us. Why are we doing it to them? This sets up this competition with China, and I think the great test of the next decade is whether we can manage that competition in such a way that we prevent it from becoming an actual conflict and we keep it as a political, diplomatic, and economic competition.
Please.
Okay. It's hard to follow after such a Joe's eloquent speech opening. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. I was looking in the room because I never had scripts for any of my speeches and everything. And I'm so happy that I say yes when I was being asked to come to this conference today, because many of you know that this is the 35th anniversary of Tiananmen this year. And I've been basically traveling every week. Next week, I will be in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University. And I remember the first time when I was giving a talk at the State Department when my book first came out, and people asked me, what's your favorite city when you give talk tours everywhere? And at that time I gave an answer. I said it was Montana, and people asked me, oh really, Montana? And they asked me why. I said because there were hundreds of people at the auditorium. They were in gray hair and blue jeans, and they came to my talk and they care. And that's what I see as superpower. So don't tell me that it's just about military. Of course, military is important. Don't tell me it's just about economics. When I knew that today is live stream, I was terrified, because for 2 decades since I became a scholar of Tiananmen massacre, I always ask people to remove me. You know, you can Google. There's no online. Nothing, right? So every time I gave a talk, I would say, please don't post online, and no Zoom, even in this Zoom time. And the fact that you can just come to this university openly and talk about it, and people didn't even bother to think, oh, it would be dangerous, it would be scary for a woman from China to talk about China. It's already the power of the powerless. And if you'd ask me what is superpower, I think that a country, a government that deployed 200,000 army soldiers in 1989 equipped with AK-47 and AK-47 and tanks against its own people, and the People's Liberation Army firing on unarmed civilians under the gaze of the entire world. And 35 years later, they ban a historian of this forbidden memory and history from its own country from going home for her grandmother's funeral. That's not a superpower, at least not in my criteria and standard as a Chinese person. And I think that today that what you are doing here, it is what a superpower should be like. We have intellectual freedom and academic freedom. How many of you still remember what happened in 1989?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, see, like, millions of people across the street took to the street pushing for political reform, right? The peaceful demonstrations, hunger strike on Tiananmen Square. And it's not just a Beijing thing. Although Gorbachev was there, that's why the whole international attention was there, the media was covering it. But that's how people got to know the image of the Tang Bang and all those. And in my lifetime, I was a teenager at that time, and then of course later in Hong Kong, just 3 years ago, I saw twice in my lifetime the statue of the goddess of democracy taken away from me in front of me, right? The first time was when the statue of goddess of democracy in Tiananmen Square, when the tank rolled over, they rolled over the statue. You know, that statue was my generation, the Tiananmen generation's longing for everything that you guys were born with in this country. And many of my students often took for granted that when they're born with it, that's liberty and freedom and democracy. Right. So we want the same thing, just like that statue in New York City, and we had our own statue of the goddess of democracy. And then in Hong Kong at that time, ironically, under the British colonial rule, they were able to have that goddess of democracy there. And just 2 years ago, when I was a professor of history there, I saw it in the middle of the night, it was disappeared. And for the Tiananmen anniversary recently, I went there and then I just kneeled down and put a flower. And afterward, not long ago, I was banned from Hong Kong, going back to my academic position. Don't tell me this is the kind of behavior that a superpower would have. So how do we understand superpower, and what is superpower, right? Military, economically, or culture? So I think that and that's why I understand that people's fear about this China threat, and of course, and I think that I would be more specific. This is a CCP threat. This is the threat from the Beijing regime, from the Communist Party, but not the Chinese people and not the Chinese government. I said this in particularly, I have been attacked for more than 2 decades now by many of the younger generation of Chinese students calling me a traitor, calling me prostitutes for the Americans, right? That's why in the introduction of my book, Professor Perry Ling mentioned that other than calling Rowena a whore for the Americans, they do not have any serious solutions for the questions that she raised about the Chinese society and politics. So I think I do not want to follow their narratives and follow their rhetorics and languages about just, you mix up the Americans and the culture and the people, right? You're not happy with your government doesn't mean that you think Americans are terrible. So it's the same thing. So I would be very careful distinguishing China and the CCP, the Beijing government. That is also, the Chinese people are also victim, including myself and many of the Tiananmen mothers. And at the same time, I think because I'm a historian, I would not just, like Joe is so eloquent, right? He's talked about the politics. I just want to give you the facts, and you can tell me whether China is a superpower and whether this is going to be sustainable, right? For a long time, this China model, people have been mesmerized by this idea that, okay, China has a lot of money in economics and everything, and would that eventually become democratic China and bring, middle class, emergence of middle class, and all this visual thinking that has been happening for a long time. And from day one, I have been saying that this is not sustainable because there's no independent middle class. So the so-called China model, it was actually a state capitalism combined with authoritarianism. So if you don't buy with the regime, you don't work with the regime, even if you're a tycoon, you're a billionaire, the next day you'll be gone. It really doesn't matter who you are, right? So even if at the top, you watch the Chinese politics these days, right? All these senior guys. In 1989, it started by the party secretary general Hu Yaobao being removed, and then it ending by another party secretary general being put under house arrest. So if you cannot even protect yourself from the very top of the leadership, and in the military, the guy who refused, Xu Qinxian, the marshal general, he refused to bring in the army, then immediately he would be put into military court. So if you look at all of these aspects that we define a superpower, and we can ask ourselves whether that can actually become a superpower. And Joe mentioned about Ukraine war and Taiwan and all of this, and I want to bring in this important aspects about, about war. It's not just about military, it's not just about economic, but it's also about historical memory. Because the reason that I think why they would be so afraid of someone like me, right? So in this country, people would think, oh, if you're banned, you must be radical, you must be studying so-called controversial, sensitive topics. And I never like to use this kind of languages to fall into the traps of the CCP, what they describe individuals like me. I wouldn't even see myself as a dissident. I'm a scholar, I'm a historian. I teach my students the historical truth. But we all know that from 1984, right? So those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. So the way that they present this narrative, for example, when the Ukraine war started, how they teach the kids about how ungrateful the Ukraine is and how justified the war by Russia was, right? So all the school kids were talking about all of this. And also about Tiananmen, of course, because we all know that people understand the responsibilities of the country's future by debating the moral meaning of history. If you tell your kids, if you tell the children that this war is a good war, this war is, Ukraine need to be invaded, Taiwan need to be invaded, then immediately you gave them this idea that this is the way to deal with conflicts and things like that. And of course, like Tiananmen, just like any other major atrocities imposed by the CCP, the Great Leap Forward, the Great Famine, and all of this great. That's why I'm very sensitive to this idea, this language about super and great. I think that it's not just those great superpower, what they can do. And I think collectively, we as individuals, we all have our citizens' autonomy and the power of the powerless. And we can also change and change our situation and not make that political control and superpower happen and take place. And if there's anything that I can call people to do here, I really hope that you will protect and preserve democracy. Let's don't ask like who can become a superpower, but let's ask what we can do for democracy to preserve and protect democracy. I ran away from that authoritarian government, and I'm in this country now in exile because I cannot return. And I do not know where I would go to if you lose your democracy in this land. So on that, I would be happy to answer more questions, but I hope that my more narratives can maybe ask us what we can do to stop that monster to become the so-called superpower. If they really take over the world, the values, the perspective, the things that we had treasure and be born with, that would really be a disaster. That war is not just a war in the battlefield, but a war of memory. And Milan Kundera described the war of people against power as the struggle of memory against forgetting. And as a historian, I think that at least, if there's nothing else, then at least that we should try collectively to keep that history and memory alive, and that's what we can do to against amnesia. I know that we may lose many battles, but I think that we are going to win the war of just, and I know that history is going to be on our side. Thank you.
Charles, I'll ask you to follow up with that. And just want to remind people that questions, please do raise your hand. The folks back there are going to distribute cards to you, so get a card, write down your questions. There's a lot of questions here, I hope.
So I look at this conversation, and honestly, I am worried. Because if you look at history, and allow me to say my context in the perspective of Africa. If you look at history, in the year 1886 in the Berlin Conference, a group of Europeans sat down and they said, because of that superpower, you will get this portion of this continent and you will have supreme authority and sovereignty over its resources, its culture, its perspective, and its people. If you look at the First World War, which I don't think it's World War, I think it's the West War, because Africa was not a cause of that war, yet Africa participated in that war. Not voluntarily, but by being forced, which was as a result of what happened in the Berlin Conference. How? The owners of the so-called countries, which we call them colonial territories, got some of its soldiers from these African countries and they took them to fight. And when we talk about history, they say history repeats itself. In the year 1940 to 1945, around that area during the World War II, the same thing happened. Now, when we flash forward in today, when we are talking about who gets the seat at that table, I am scared because that table is a symbol of power. And when we are talking about power, we are talking about control. In other words, who control the world. And when we are looking at this conversation, I am scared in the context of Africa because as it is today, we have the influence of China in the African continent. We have the influence of Europe in the African continent, and of course the US in the African continent. That's why you will hear a summit like US-Africa Summit. You will hear summits and conventions like the Commonwealth. You will hear summits and conventions like French-African Convention, Chinese-African Convention. And I get worried because when we are looking at all these things, and in the context and in the continent of Africa, I look at Africa and I'm scared because there is a move, which is already there, on how Africa is being controlled in terms of culture, perspective, people, and sadly, resources. Every one of us here has an iPhone or a phone. And almost 80 or big percentage of the materials used to make that phone comes from Africa. And as it is today, when we are looking at the wars between US, China, and all that, Russia and all that, where do you think Africa will come in? Now, I am scared because all these things that I've said happen to be like who gets the seat at the table. It's all about competition. It's all about who gets to control the world. And to me, in my perspective and in my reasoning, as Professor has said, I think when we look at democracy, I think it will win. Not only locally, but globally, where you and I and the people have the ability to decide how we want to live our lives based on our own different cultures, our own different values, our own different views and perspective, and everyone else to have respect on that. So that's my introduction.
Wow. I wanted to ask Elijah, the questions and stuff, we're going to start rounding them up, or we want to wait a little bit? No, I'm good, yeah. Thank you. Wow, thank you guys. I mean, this is an amazing beginning for a conversation that could go a long ways, eh? But you have to leave, right?
Oh, no, I'm fine. Go.
You know, one of the things that I was considering as you guys were speaking was that considering that the world order and how it came about since the Bretton Woods Accords, you know, creating the World Bank, IMF, and then we have the Bretton Woods II, which was back in the 70s, when Richard Nixon stated that there's no longer any need for the United States to compete with one hand tied behind her back. And that's exactly when, some of you will remember, he heralded the end of the post-war economic order, suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold. I don't know if you guys remember this. At the time of the Bretton Woods Accords, the U.S. economy was equivalent to 50% of global GDP. And at that time, the U.S. had held 70% of the gold deposits in the world. And with that, it had huge power. And with that, it carried the day during the Bretton Woods Accords, creating the World Bank and the IMF. And they were able to then peg the world economy to the dollar, contrary to the suggestion earlier, which was to make sort of like a a world sort of based on global and all the currencies from around the world. So I'm taking a little bit to get to the question, but it's important to have this background. The question would be to you all, how do you guys see this world order in our day and age? And the louder and louder shouts from the global south of ending what is viewed as a period of continued neo-colonialism, or colonialism really, financial colonialism, through the sheer force of the economic juggernaut that the US was and that China is now closely pursuing.
Yeah. Let me take a shot at it. First of all, I'd love to take your class, because I don't remember any of that. I'd like to know. And second, I think Charles's beautiful accent is a completely unfair advantage to him on this panel, because you just want to keep listening to him talk. And on this issue, I take to heart what you say, because what we're talking about, especially if you're a U.S. national security analyst, you always assume that it's a good thing that the U.S. runs the world, right? And so we want to protect this structure, but the structure is demonstrably unfair. It's demonstrably. I mean, we have benefited from our hegemony, economic, political, military hegemony, and realized vast profits from the rest of the world because we've basically been able to dictate the terms of commerce. And that's now changing. And you can feel it eroding. And one of the things that China has in its favor is it's presenting an alternative source of money, of diplomacy, an alternative structure. And a lot of that competition has taken place in Africa. So I would like to hear from the other two panelists, this is more of a question than an answer, about how this is playing out. Is this succeeding? Is China's influence growing in Africa? Are there African countries, or are some of these countries just sort of using the threat of going over to a China-based structure as a way to increase their leverage with the U.S.? Those are genuine questions. I see it playing out, but I'm not close enough to it to understand if it's working or not. Go, yeah.
Okay, so I would like to respond to both our moderator and Joe. I think that when we talk about superpower, maybe there's the power that's measurable with the money, with the military, how many guns you have and things like that, but we also have the soft power. Yeah. That's the human being, that's the people, right? I remember again when I was speaking at the State Department, people were telling me, Rowena, but we have to look after, we know that, okay, whatever you said is important, right? Human rights in China, blah, blah, blah. But here we have our voters' interest, economic interest we have to look after. So we cannot just, China is China. But at that time I make this argument, I said that, well, you may think that it's just about China, but it's in this global village. If the plane got hijacked, it really doesn't, just like Titanic, it really doesn't matter, you got a business class, I got a window seat. We will all end up in the same place. And at that time they asked me, can you give me an example? I said, by the time I have an obvious example, that would be too late. And then 2020, COVID. The violation of human rights of one medical doctor in the small city of Wuhan who tried to warn us about COVID, and he was silenced. He was taken to the police station. He was humiliated. He was crucified. And the violation of one human being in China became the violation of human rights of every single human being in this world. And don't tell me that it's not just about China and not about us, and don't tell me it's not just about then and not about now. I think many of the things is interconnected. Like there are things that we cannot just say we will measure this way and that way. So I think that it's equally important to look at the soft power and have. And the second thing that I think related to Joe and Charles was talking about, I think the mechanism that we set up after World War II, right? So at that time, because of the war threats, and then we set up all this mechanism. But whether China or any of these countries is playing the game by the rules, that's a different thing. You have the mechanism, but they do not follow the rules, and I think that's always a challenge, right? So whether we should become them because now they are taking over, because they are doing all of this. Many times, if you look at the American classrooms, including the attacks against me, I think that they often use democracy to undermine democracy, right? So they take advantage of all these mechanisms set out in this country, and then they said that we have to do this, but then there they do not do it, and then they are exporting all this narrative over. So I think that's another danger about colonization. Of course, I hear you, right? The One Belt, One Road policy that we are all very familiar with, right? But it seems to me it's just like another form of economic colonization in Africa and in many other countries. And domestically, China is also doing colonization, right? So they are in the internal colonization of Hong Kong, right? So in Xinjiang, in Tibet. So all these people, and even the Chinese people. So I think this kind of taking over. But of course, I always ask this question, whether everything they're doing is sustainable. Right? Can you keep on not giving people freedom and just say, I give you the money? And that contract they sign with the society, meaning you can do anything you like to make money, but we won't give you freedom, right? Is that going to be sustainable? And you already saw that that's not sustainable. Look at the recent collapse of the real estate in China now, and many newly graduates, they cannot get jobs, and so many Chinese people, they cannot vote in China, as we say in Chinese. They use out their feet to vote, to go all the way to the Mexican border to smuggle themselves in the United States. So they cannot vote with their votes, but they vote with their feet, risking the life of their wives and the children, and then they came to the United States. That's the most telling thing about that, whether China was going to become a superpower. The superpower people's government officials would not send their kids and their money outside if that's a real superpower. They're all sending their money, their kids to the United States. So I think that the answer is clear. But I share Joe's concern. There are so many reasons for us to be concerned about what the CCP is doing to the world now. And if there's a war, and which is not impossible, and sometimes we worry that it will be any time because of Taiwan. If you look at history, whenever they have this concern about domestic crisis and they cannot handle it, they need an outside enemy, then it would be a good time to start the war in Taiwan and take over and things like that. But of course they have been playing this nationalism card, right? The CCP has been playing this. Whenever there's some crisis, they will play the nationalism card. The most obvious after Tiananmen, they have this extensive patriotic education campaign from kindergarten all the way up, right? So establish these outside enemies and so-called patriotic, not distinguish between the people and the nation, and they always say anyone who's critical of the CCP is anti-China foreign forces and silencing people. And that's why you saw the whole emergence of younger generation defending the CCP as if they were defending China. So that's a danger if in the army. However, any nationalism is a double-edged sword. Right, you play it, you overplay too long, and when people feel that you're not doing enough for us because you kept radicalize each other, and then eventually they will feel that you're not doing enough, and that will come back to themselves.
May I interrupt for a question? Is that okay?
Yes. Yeah.
You say that China might play the nationalist card, that it might do an invasion of Taiwan for domestic reasons to shore up the regime. Can I just, what do you think China wants? Is it mainly about preserving its internal authority of the CCP, or does it have territorial ambitions that extend beyond Taiwan? Is it an expansionist power?
I think that because it's not a democracy. So most of the time people often think about things like, oh, they're competing with us, they're doing this and that. But in the mind of the top leaders, there is always whether they can maintain power. Yeah. It's more what they can achieve. So I think this kind of competition idea, it seems to me, is not a real competition saying, oh, I want to win the United States or this kind of thing. It's more about how they can maintain power at whatever cost. So Tiananmen is not a solution, we knew that. Right? You deploy army soldiers against your people, it's not going to be sustainable. That's why Gorbachev did not do it when he faced the same crisis, because he knew that the Tiananmen solution was not a solution. That's why you saw the collapse of the socialist bloc, Eastern Europe, and all of this. So I think that the key here, maybe that's an excellent question, Joe, that very often people misunderstood this as a competition and we are just competing, but it's a totally different mindset and different language and mentality. Of the competition. I can give you a good example. I was talking to Professor Lawrence sitting there. When I saw all these mountains yesterday, this is the first time I'm here in Colorado, and I never, every time people told me there were lots of mountains, I was reminded about my childhood when my parents were exiled in the mountains. That would mean that deprivation of food, heat, water, and separation of my parents. So mountains was terrifying thing for me. When I see this mountain, I say, oh my God, this is so pretty. I can live here if I can afford it. So this kind of loss in translation happen very often when we discuss about China and the policy dealing with China. I already mentioned during my opening speech, people often think, oh geez, this woman must be radical because she's banned from China, let's stay away from her and things things like that. But all my students, I've taught at Harvard, at Wellesley College, in Vermont Liberal Arts College. I taught in so many different places in Hong Kong. All my students would immediately say, "Really? Her, Rowena?" Right? Because they all know that I teach, I write, right? At night, I watch Law and Order when I'm unhappy. That's my antidepressant, because I need someone to tell me that, hey, within an hour, you will see justice is done, right? That's quick. Because in my real life, I never had that, right? Detective Benson is my hero. So how can she be banned from going back to her job? But that's exactly what I mean by lost in translation, and we are doing with a totally different everything. So without understanding the roots of these differences, it's hard to just say, hey, let's go for a war, and that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I have a follow-up question on the CCP, but I want Charles to take a stab at what we were talking about in terms of the Global South speaking louder and louder and wanting a change.
I think we are in a period of scramble for the global South in what we call neo-colonialism, and that is an ideology or a concept that is aimed at influencing how people, specifically, let me use the African context, how people have perspective as far as life is concerned, and how people or countries can be able to be controlled as far as how they can go economically and politically. Let me give you an example. I come from Kenya, and we were colonized by the British, and to me, I will call it a way of trying to clean their guilt. They put us all in an organization called the Commonwealth. I'm sure you all know of it. But I'm sitting here and I'm asking myself, how come the United States is not part of the Commonwealth, yet it was also colonized by the British? And it all comes down to whoever you have the ability to control, you can be able to dictate what they do, where they go, and how they see themselves in terms of perspective. Now, when we come in today, the aspect of China in the picture and all that, I think, to me, it's an aspect of responsibility that superpowers want to have, but I also think that it is also a move to direct how we can be able to scramble some of the resources that are out there. And when we say these countries, this superpower, who gets the seat at the table, I look at it as a season whereby, if we are not careful, we can have a big conflict that will affect the whole world because of all this. To come close to your question, I would say that the issue here is not things or concepts or models like democracy. I think the issue here is about the faults that people are using in the loopholes like the concept of democracy has. And if we are not very careful to close some of the loopholes, we will come to a point whereby the perspective of who leads the nation or who runs the nation will be categorized as the perspective of the citizens of that nation, which is not necessarily the truth. I've spent a few minutes with Professor here, and to now, I do not understand how she cannot go back to her country. Why? Because her perspective does not really in line with the perspective of what we see happening out there. And this makes me sad, because I am sure there are a lot of innocent people out there who have a very good intention, but how few individuals in the leadership realm create a perspective where the whole world will see a certain nation or a certain country to be like this, that can cause these conflicts, to have battles or nations fight with each other. So I think it's very important we really look at these models like democracy. There are loopholes that we have to fix, or else this fire will continue to burn significantly and in a very fast rate.
Yeah, I think that one of the important things about democracy is that it takes a lot of work. And people tend to forget about that. And as in the global north, as you know, we are sitting there in the comfort of our seats and we can just click a button and order whatever we want from Amazon, and we can, you know, go ski in Vail or do whatever we want. And we forget that we actually should be out there talking to our representative, and that we should be doing, you know, things that are important to actually have democracy working. One of the things that is evident here in the questions is kind of still staying on this sort of global big picture. One of the students present is asking, and perhaps this is a little related to you, Joe. Are there other rising global superpowers that the United States should be concerned about hurting other democracies and or our national security? Now, within that context, I want to throw out here, and so that we have the panel here talking along that, and perhaps to your point right now, Charles, is one of the questions is, how would we restructure the UN system so that then we could have a better world? And then going back to, I think, kind of like to what I was talking about in my question, we're talking about on the question of economic colonialism and the Bretton Woods, the issue of debt. The current restructuring of the IFIs, the international financial institutions, could help to restructure world order. Or the global, as the global south gains representation on these IFIs, do you see this imperative? Do you see this in practice, other structures in the international world order? So there's a lot of questions there, but I mean, here we could. Who's bringing the beer?
Yeah. That's a big flaw in this conference. There's not enough alcohol. There are no other superpowers.
Yeah.
The United States is the only superpower.
Right.
I mean, Russia matches us in nuclear weapons. China matches us in gross domestic product or economic power, or comes close to it. But nobody has the whole suite. Nobody dominates the world like we do, economically, politically, diplomatically, culturally. I've been to China 4 or 5 times, and I remember going to rural villages and seeing Chinese kids dance to hip hop music. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's unbelievable how much influence we have. And all of you have been out in the world. I mean, you just feel it. I mean, for one thing, it's great to speak English in this world. Every place you go, people speak English. So there's no other power like that. But there is this challenge of democracy, and we were talking about it in an earlier panel. You have Russia, China, and India who have adopted autocratic models. Now we had great hopes for all 3 of them emerging from periods of authoritarian or of emerging colonialism and adopting democratic models. And for a period, some of them did. But it's going the other way now. So it's not that these 3 represent a sort of a challenge that they could somehow conquer the United States, but they might be able to overthrow our model of governance. And we think about this democratic system as being the shining beacon for the world, and this is the way the world should go, and we're naturally evolve. History has a funny way of going in a loop. It's not at all clear that the democracy model can survive. To get to your point, it's a constant struggle, and it's being threatened on sort of that level, rather than India directly challenging us It's challenging us by adopting an entirely different model of governance, and thus, will weaken the democratic framework that we seek to project onto the global stage.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm still
Okay,
Processing.
yeah, processing.
Okay, I'm trying to
Sorry.
be the Chinese woman polite. Can I?
Please, go ahead.
Okay. Geez, I forgot what I went. So, can I follow up, because just now we were talking about the different interpretations and things. I think in my case, it's not that much about different interpretation about the situation and perspective. That's another thing maybe is lost in translation. I think the CCP do not like people to understand and see the true historical past. The reason they do not want people to do that, because that's closely connected to the legitimacy of the regime. If people find out that you kill their people, you deploy the army soldiers to kill your own people, then you immediately lose your legitimacy. In order to establish that or re-establish that legitimacy, they have to have a narrative that would be embedded into the collective memory of the whole nation, of the nation's most immediate past. Meaning, I do this for you, right? Tiananmen massacre, I do it for you. If it had not been for that, how can we have this prosperity? Right? Can we have this China rising, like China dream? So it's very similar if you remind the 1930s in Japan, the Japanese dream, right? So all of these are narratives that they are creating. But of course, the implication when Deng Xiaoping went to Shenzhen 1992 after the Tiananmen massacre to reestablish the thing that let's forget about anything else, just make money whatever way you want. And then the second main point he brought up is that it's the right thing that we crack down. We have that. So basically, the message to the people is very clear. As long as you can make money, you can compromise and sacrifice anything. Human life, human dignity, human decency, anything. There's no bottom line. And I think that's what we see now, that consequences. Whatever we are seeing in this world order and civilization and crashing, those are nonsense, it seems to me. It's not the crash of civilizations. It's just the authoritarian government trying to export their narratives and ideas. So I do not think that it's a different perspective in diversity, whatever that we are talking about, and that's why I was being silenced. It's more about that they do not want people to know the historical truth of the past, because that has implications to how people understand. After Tiananmen, only 2 types of demonstrations would be allowed in Chinese streets, and then you can go home proudly. Anti-US, anti-Japan.
Raina, to your point there, one of the questions came up here, and perhaps it also talks a little bit to what you were saying, Joe. And it's like, do you see the central control of the CCP resulting in a declining capitalistic market?
Can you say that again?
The decline of the capitalistic market, so the system, but I think that just by your answer there, that money is everything, kind of answers the question and says, no, let's keep on going with this.
So the China model has been the state capitalism model with authoritarianism. It's not a real capitalist market. There's no free market. You don't agree that if the government, Jack Ma, do you know who Jack Ma is? Alibaba, right? So Jack Ma, he's so powerful, he's so rich, but then the government doesn't like him. Xiao Jianhua, he donated millions of dollars to Harvard, right? The moment the government didn't like it, he was hijacked from Four Seasons in Hong Kong, and he hired 5 women as his bodyguards. It doesn't matter. He just disappeared. And we don't know where he is. So that teaches you a lesson, and whatever capitalism you talk about is not a free market, it's not capitalism you think about here. That's why I said it's state capitalism combined with authoritarianism. So in the first 30 years, people often say the 30 years since 1949, the CCP came into power, the first 30 years they took all the private properties and money from the individuals, and then they redistribute it to their own people in the later 30 years after in the reform era. So it's just a redistribution of the wealth and the properties of the country. So that kind of capitalism is always connected with state power.
So, can I jump in a little bit?
Yes, please. We're waiting.
I think let's all agree the United States of America influences the world in a very big way. And
Can I interrupt you 1 second? There are 3 questions here that are directed directly to you.
okay.
And so why don't you weave that into your answers?
Yeah, I'm just saying that there has to be a significant sense of responsibility from what we call the so-called superpowers to understand and realize that their responsibility does not only have an impact on their people, but the whole world. That's all I wanted to say.
So that, what you just said, pretty much answers this question, which was, what do you think about China's influence and interest in Africa versus the lack of US involvement?
First of all, I think China's influence in Africa brings and contributes a clear indication that there are a lot of disadvantages in terms of the terms of engagement. Let me give you an example. I think it's in Zimbabwe where China built a parliament for the government. And you won't believe it, out of that parliament, there is the flag of China. What does that tell you? So that's one of the many few things. So to me, I think it's a symbol of something. And I am all for international trade. I am all for international trade, but at the same time, I am for fair trade. And when you also come to aspects like IMF and the African countries, the cost of capital or the cost of borrowing is not also fair, and that I will also have to say. The reason, it is not safe to invest in Africa. The same organizations that say it is not safe to invest in Africa are the same organizations that cannot survive if they don't get the resources from Africa. What does that tell you? So, it will all come to that one thing. Is there responsibility and is there fairness? Countries can trade with one another. I advocate for that, and I believe in that, because we are a world that needs each other. But at the same time, the trading should be trading and not hiding in terms of exploitation and call it trade. That's my point.
Well, Charles, just to follow up real quickly on that, one of the things that people will argue is that you really, yes, absolutely you need to have that, but you need to have the African voices at the table, and they need to demand to have that institutionality to be able to demand and to actually hold the rest accountable to that. And so then a question from the audience related to that is it better for Africa and the Global South that the USA is no longer the single hegemon?
Say that again?
That it's not just the US now that is the big power. It's like we're having more. So you have China, a large percentage, China is investing billions in Africa, and now they're in Latin America, and so on. So, I mean, there's a difference there. There's how do you say it? There's a spread of this development money aid, et cetera.
I do not want to say that US should get out of Africa wholly or US is bad at the same time. I do not want to say that, and that's not what I imply. All I imply is the fact that when we look at Africa, let's not look at Africa as commodities. Let's look at Africa as a continent with people just like you. Let's look at Africa with individuals who have dignity, and let's not look at Africa as a place where we can exploit. The second thing I also want to say when we're talking about involvement in Africa, let's look at Africa in terms of a country where their voice also matter. Here's the thing. I think Africa is not really truly involved in sitting at the table. I look at Africa not as an entity that sits at the table, but I look at Africa as an entity that is on the menu. And if we do not change that, I think this whole cycle of colonialism will always be in our minds, always be in our hearts, and always be in our mouths. Because if we do not embrace and appreciate the voice of Africa and the perspective of Africa and the contributions of Africa, then we are missing something. In Africa today, an election of Africa will only be considered credible if an entity in the West says so. If we look at Africa today, a certain government is being controlled and being told that you have to make these laws, and if you do not, we will stop doing certain things. And if we look at Africa today, we look at aid as an economy of its own. And if truly aid could be working, Africa could be a first world country today. But aid has become a business. And that business, there are some entities that do not want to bring that solution, for example, of water, to end, because if it's ending, then aid to that issue will not longer be coming. So if we do not look at these issues with genuinity, credibility, and honesty to truly solve them, all this will be a cycle that will repeat itself. And unless Africa's voice is being respected, honored, and appreciated, and listened, then this conversation will keep on going. Thank you.
Listen, that's a fantastic topic. I think I need to invite you to my class next week, because I'm going to be talking precisely about that, and then you can come as well. We're talking about aid and so forth. Unfortunately, the time's coming to an end here. There are many other questions. I hope that I've kind of cornered them around. I'd like to give each of you 30 seconds or something for a final statement.
You know, there's so much else to say here, and we're just out of time. But I think for me, it's possible to look at the last several hundred years of the West's involvement, with the developing world, including Africa, as a period where the West just enriched itself at the expense of these countries. We just sucked the money out of it, the resources out of it, and became quite wealthy. And that is to my mind, the major reason why you have these fundamental problems still in Africa and other areas of the developing world. And the way to fix that is to pour money back in. Well, that's not going to happen, right? There's no way the West is going to return even a large percentage of the money we sucked out. That's not quite the loophole of democracy you were talking about, but it's a fundamental problem with the relationship between the developed West and the developing world that persists. And China now comes in and can exploit that and can appeal in a way that the U.S. simply cannot to some of these developing countries, presenting an alternative model, presenting a criticism of the way the West has treated the developing world. The United States has yet to come to grips with that fundamental problem. It isn't that we ignore Africa or we're not paying attention to Africa, but we can't sort of admit that fundamental truth because it's too expensive. And it would cause a huge backlash in our own political system if we even tried to come close to describing that as one of the fundamental issues. So I don't have any solutions to this problem, but I think it's important to recognize that economic dimension to this subject of global hegemony.
30 seconds, Arena, please.
Okay. I fully agree. Just quickly follow up with Joe, and then I'll make my concluding. So I think that I fully agree with Charles. African has been used by the Chinese government too, and in a different way to show that we want the allies against democracy, and we are helping you, and we are giving you all of this, and then you need to be with us in the United Nations and all of these developing countries. I think that manipulation can be dangerous as well. And I understand democracy is not let you get married, you are happy ever after. It's not perfect. But I think that democracy is the key. Without democracy, we cannot safeguard academic freedom, we cannot safeguard individual freedom, we cannot safeguard liberty, and any of this, which is the essence, it seems to me, to be powerful. The CCP can appear powerful, but they're very weak, and the way that they are so aggressive and very often is because they are weak, and without democracy that we cannot. I think a democratic China is to the benefit of everyone, to avoid a war, and I think with that, each individual citizen, maybe in our daily life, we don't have to ask what our leaders can do. We can also ask what we can do as citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, please, 30 seconds.
I think I'll say like sometimes going back to accept the mistakes that were done is one of the first steps of taking responsibility. And even though it could be expensive, I think not going back, not going to face that responsibility is more expensive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to this panel. It's been a pleasure really to be able to have this discussion with you. Joe, Marina, and Charles, thank you so much. I want to give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for having come, and have a good afternoon. Go find that beer.
There is a dinner tonight. I wonder if there's going to be alcohol there.